Today we're going to be talking about money as the language of power. Ron Paul has this great quote. He said that money is the most sought after monopolistic power of man. Money is certainly the most powerful material incentive in the world, and it seems to be something that touches almost every domain of human affairs. And because it has so much influence on human psychology, the shape of society, the ability to wield power, both physically and politically, which we'll get into, money is a source of great temptation for people. And on this point, Hernan Cortes in the 16th century, who was the governor of New Spain, has a great quote. He said, "I and my companions suffer from a disease of the heart which can only be cured by gold." The avarice and the greed that manifests in some people's hearts is most easily satiated with money, which makes money one of the most pursued and sought after powers in the world. But you might be asking yourself, so why? Why so sought after? What is it about power? What is it what is the power of money, you might say? And I think we should start by with the simple fact that we are an interdependent social animal, which means we need one another, the favors of one another, the skills and knowledge of one another to thrive. Not only in the present moment across space with all of our living peers, but also across time, right? This is how we accumulate knowledge. And we, stand on the shoulders of the proverbial giants. This is something that is just a reality, right? It's like no one can do it on their own. You often hear these people talking about certain people as, say, a self-made man, and I just think that's a totally bogus perspective on anyone, right? Everyone was born to some parents that took care of them. Everyone was a child and had a lot of help along the way in coming to adulthood. And then even in adulthood, we all work inside of businesses, we all work with one another, we collaborate at scale to solve our biggest and most challenging problems. So I think the idea of anyone being independently and completely self-made in some isolated way is just a farce. And another way to look at money is that it's the tool that actually helped us scale our reciprocal altruism. And reciprocal altruism is something that Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, wrote about. This is a term he coined. And in his book in 1976 titled The Selfish Gene, Dawkins discussed reciprocal altruism as a strategy that can evolve under certain conditions, especially when individuals are likely to encounter each other repeatedly. So, it might be in my best interest to, say, screw you over in the deal, right? If you deliver me the money and I'm supposed to deliver the goods, well, if you delivered the money first, well, maybe I should just abscond with the goods. But if I know that I'm gonna see you again, right, and we exist in a community together, and we're gonna have repeated interactions, then I'm much less likely to behave in that way. I'm much more likely to reciprocate the favors that you do for me. So this idea of reciprocal altruism is really the concept of, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And eventually this strategy can become evolutionarily stable because it actually enhances survival and reproductive success for those individuals that reciprocate with one another over time. Again, we are very collaborative species. to use the economics term, we benefit from the division of labor when we collaborate and specialize economically, such that I can do what I'm best at, you can do what you're best at, and then we can both trade and both enjoy the specialized fruits of one another's labor, right? We can do that at scale, and it is that game dynamic that's really premised on the rule set of private property that allows us to increase our knowledge and our standards of living over time. It's how we got into the modern age where we enjoy all these technological luxuries like we do today. You know, reciprocal altruism, it's something that occurs with most social animals, actually. You know, a wolf that brings down an animal will share it with the pack, right? He doesn't try to eat it all to himself. They do, you know, the alpha wolf does kind of eat his fill before he shares the kill, but he shares nonetheless, and he knows that by sharing, that's a good strategy for, you know, the future moose that they need to bring down that he may not be able to. You know, maybe one of the other wolves will bring it down instead. So by sharing, they actually increase the evolutionary fitness of the pack. And, you know, humans basically are the same. We kind of take it to the next level with money, though, because we take this idea of reciprocal altruism, which can really only work within a small circle of trust, you know, typically within the scope of, say, the Dunbar's number, which is roughly 150 people, which is basically the cognitive limit of how many people we can know by name and by face to interact with on a regular basis. We can know more people by name and by face, but like to have a circle of trust is typically quantified at around 150 people. But with money, we have this accounting system, right, by which we're actually accounting for the favors that have been rendered across time and that are due to be rendered in the future. When it's functioning properly, money is something that makes reciprocal altruism mathematically precise. And this is very interesting because it kind of makes it impersonal at that point and makes it, well, very, very precise, right? It's the accounting's not, oh, you know, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours later. It's no, like, I gave you 37.2 scratches at this point in time and you owe me 37.2 in the future. You know, it's something much more like that. And so if you think about it like this, every time you go to work, you produce something for someone else. That's what a job is, right? You receive money in return. You are paid salary, wage, whatever it may be. Therefore, in doing that, just that exchange right there, you have added to the productive output of the species, but you haven't subtracted from it yet, as long as you still hold that money, right? So later, you obviously have the option to take that money that you earned and trade it to someone else to receive a favor from them in exchange, right? You can go to the restaurant and buy food, or go to the store and buy shoes, or whatever it may be. And so it's this accounting system for favors, if you will, that is money, that allows human beings to scratch each other's backs without even needing to know or trust one another, right? That you can just, you know, you can walk into a store with strangers and just give them money and they don't need to know that you're good for it, right? It's like they're trusting that the money has integrity rather than you having personal integrity. And this is really kind of the basis on which we build interactions with strangers, right? That really is one of the main qualities of civilization. So Nick Szabo, who many of you guys have probably heard of, a famous computer scientist and cryptographer, known for his work in digital currencies before Bitcoin. He's written extensively on the concept of trust minimization as it relates to money. And his basic argument is that money should be designed to minimize the need to trust in third parties, such, you know, really anyone, right? To trust another person, to trust a bank, to trust a government, because those intermediaries introduce the risk of fraud, censorship, inefficiency, etc., right? You've introduced what's called counterparty risk, which is the risk that the counterpart to your transaction will break their promise. And so trust minimization means creating a system where participants do not need to rely on the integrity or reliability of other people to verify transactions or, store purchasing power across time. In other words, as this pertains to money, an ideal trust minimized money is one that minimizes the dependence on human promises, right? Something, ideally with like mathematical integrity or thermodynamic integrity, something that's rooted in physical laws that we can't easily change on a whim, right? And this is not to throw out promises as like a very important part of human interaction, right? Promises like, contracts. A contract is a formalized promise between two counterparties. General agreements, even implicit things like morality, right? These things are agreements too, even though they're more implicit rather than explicit. These are all necessary for humans to interact with one another in a productive way, but they're all ultimately promises that run the risk of being broken. And so again, that's why an ideal money would be minimally dependent on promises so that people could use this money to trade favors with one another without the fear, or with a minimal fear, let's say, of that money breaking, right? If the money is based on promises, then it's as breakable as a promise. But if the money is based on work, energy, mathematics, things like this, then those things are much more difficult to break, therefore imbuing the money with much higher integrity. So again, looking at money as this means by which we trade favors, since every favor requires the power of human labor to produce or to render, we could say something like money is the language of labor power. But let's break this definition down. Why are we saying that money is a language? Well, money is expressed in terms of mathematics, and mathematics, as Galileo said, is the language of the universe. In Galileo's 1623 book, The Assayer, he wrote the following, quote, "Philosophy is written in that great book which ever lies before our eyes. I mean the universe, but we cannot understand it if we do not first learn the language and grasp the symbols in which it is written. This book is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering around in a dark labyrinth." Unquote. Mathematics, obviously a very fundamental language. It is something that is universal, right? It's cross-cultural. In the sphere of economic production, it is we are using the same mathematics that are used in China and in India, etc. Like the world is standardized to this one common language, and in doing so, we not only have a vernacular that we can all speak, like a channel through which we can all communicate, but we also have something that very precisely maps the contours of reality, right? You could say, as Galileo said above, it's this very precise language. And it is a language in the sense, too, that it has evolved and changed over time, right? The mathematics of 500 years ago are much less sophisticated than the mathematics we use today. So as our understanding of the world changes, so too do the mathematics that we use. But as this relates to money, well, money is what expresses the products of human labor power in mathematical terms. So we're not just talking about the qualities of things when we express them in money, but rather we are translating them into the quantitative appraisal of the value of these things, which is the price, right? And then that price is something that allows all of us to communicate about the relevance of that asset in the big sphere of all these human wants, right? Everyone wants these problems solved. Well, there's only so much of things in the world available to solve those problems. And so through the bid-ask auction process of the market, you arrive at the price. And so it's a very potent form of data compression, right? You don't need to know why everyone wants this thing so much. You don't need to know how much of it is in existence. You just need to know that single number to act upon, right? If you're a producer and the price goes up, well, then you're incentivized to produce more. And on the other side of the market and the price goes up, you are incentivized as a consumer to consume less or use something else, basically. So price signals facilitated, which are mathematical, which are numbers basically, that are facilitated and expressed through money are one of the most important communication devices in the world. That's one take on why money is a language, right? It's a telecommunication device in terms of enabling a pricing system. I want to read an excerpt now from Laird Money that gives another perspective on this. Nick Bhatia writes, quote, "Money isn't only used as a medium of exchange and a store of value. It's also a counting system. It's a way of listing prices, tallying revenue, calculating profits, and bringing the entire array of economic activity under the accounting denomination." The Latin root of the word denomination is nomen, or name. So in Latin, nomen is the root form of nomen. Not sure if I'm pronouncing these right, but hopefully you get the gist. Nomin is the root form of nomen, Nomen, which means name. Nomen refers to a name, designation, or title, and is the origin of various English words related to naming, titles, and identity. The root nomen appears in Latin-derived English words, especially in those connected to naming or categorization. For example, we have the word nominate, which means to propose a name for a position or role. It's also where we get the word nomenclature, which is a system of naming, particularly in science or taxonomy. And finally, relevant to our discussion today, it's also where we get the word denomination, a name or designation for a group or class, such as in religious denominations. And Nick later on has another good excerpt that I want to read here. He says, in the same way that religious denominations let people name their particular beliefs, accounting denominations are the way for people to name their revenues, expenses, and profits, unquote. So it's naming, right? It's labeling. It's putting an informational layer on these things. So the takeaway there is denomination is a naming process, or a naming, a way to apply a name to things, right? So again, you might typically think of your church denomination, which is going to be a certain name for a set of beliefs, but there's also, currency denominations where you're actually choosing a terminology, albeit a mathematical terminology, to quote unquote name different economic phenomenon, right? Revenues, expenses, profits, etc. And really quantifying these things, right? We're trying to convert qualitative aspects of experience into something that's quantitative, measurable, comparable. This is all really useful for communication. Understanding denomination in that way, I think helps, you see its root in the Latin word that pertains to name, and then you get a better sense of why money has a linguistic function and is language-like. So if we go back to the phrase we were breaking down in the first place, which was money is the language of labor power, if we come to understand the term, we've got the language piece sort of dialed in now, so let's move on to the labor power. And I think if we come to understand the term labor power properly, we'll actually see that it's a bit redundant. So let's start with labor. In economics, labor specifically refers to the mental and physical work that people do in producing goods and services. And in physics, work is defined as the process of energy transfer that occurs when a force is applied to an object, causing it to move in the direction of that force. Mathematically, work is given by the formula force times distance times theta. And I'll explain what theta means. So force is the magnitude of the applied force. This is measured in terms of force equals mass times acceleration. Distance is the displacement of the object in the direction of the force. And finally, theta is the angle between the force vector and the displacement vector. So if you basically push something, the displacement vector, let's say, is this way, flat this way, but the force vector is diagonal to that, well, it's not going to cause it to have as much forward movement as it would if it were perfectly aligned. So that's why, if the angle is off, then you're going to have basically less force applied directionally. Looking again at work in terms of its physics definition, the unit of work is the joule, typically denoted by the letter J, where 1 joule is equal to 1 Newton of force moving an object 1 meter in the direction of the force. So 1 joule equals 1 Newton times 1 meter. And again, if you were applying that at a different angle, you'd move it less than a meter. So you'd expend more energy to move less distance, and that's why the alignment matters. So essentially, work is how directly a force is applied to an object across a distance. Now, also in looking at this in physics, in terms used in physics, power is defined at the rate at which work is done, or the rate at which energy is transferred. Mathematically, power is expressed as work divided by time, or you could say energy transferred divided by time. Work is energy transferred across distance, and power is like the rate at which energy is transferred across distance. The standard unit of power in physics is the watt, typically denoted by the W, where 1 watt equals 1 joule of energy transferred per second. So 1 watt equals 1 joule per second. So essentially, power is something like, how quickly and directly a force is applied across a distance. So when we go back to our original phrase, which contains the term labor power, it's kind of redundant because labor refers to work that is done. Work refers to energy transfer over time. And power is defined as the rate at which energy is transferred over time. I really think we can just drop the labor piece once we understand how power is defined in the eyes of physics. Oftentimes people use the word power to refer to political power, which we're going to get into this, but if you understand it from a physics perspective, I think we can rephrase the sentence we said earlier, this time dropping that redundancy of labor, and we can just define money as the language of power. And this, obviously matches like the old adage, money is power, right? But that omits the language component because there is this social element to it, right? That people are using this to communicate about power, about the products of power, and even to plan, right? When you're building a business, you're sort of planning with money how the power will be distributed to create products and sell them to other people. So I think it's a pretty good definition. It's, I think, going to be the title of this episode. However, we are left with this ambivalence in the word power, which is often, you could understand power as the capacity for a certain action, right? Let's say, does your phone have enough power to turn on, right? That's a very physical, a reference to physical power, right? There's nothing political about the power to turn on, necessary to turn on your phone. Or it could refer to authority within a social hierarchy, as in, the power to tell someone what to do, right? Does the president have the power to sign that law into effect? Something like that. Now, these things are very closely related, obviously, that, political power is always backed by the threat of physical power. It's kind of like political power is like, do this because someone says so, or else, there's the shadow of the law or some threat behind it. So ultimately, I think, it's important to realize that all of this does ground out in physics, although the word power itself gets clouded in this sense of the physical and the political when people use it typically. And I think they typically lean more towards the political because, physics is not maybe the most popular subject for people to study. But this doesn't make money, if money is the language of power, this doesn't make it a bad thing, right? Again, I think people have this taboo with the word power because they're typically referring to political power, which is based on, the threat of violence and the lack of consent. And so people have this taboo as it relates to the word power. But when you understand power from a physics standpoint, there's nothing bad about it at all, right? It's amoral, right? It's just a principle of reality. Indeed, all phenomenon in physical reality ground out in physical power. On this, I really like the excerpt from the book The Physics of Life, where author Adrian Bajan writes, quote, "The phenomenon of life and evolution is how power, production, and dissipation conspire to facilitate all movement on Earth, animate and inanimate, river, wind, animal, human, and machine. This is a distinct phenomenon and a first principle of physics," unquote. So, E equals mc squared. The entire universe is made of energy. Even matter is just low frequency or frozen energy. The movement of that energy across time is power, basically, right? So it's all power all the way down. And that's not political, basically, right? That's physical, not political. So again, this relates to money in kind of an interesting way, though, because if you look at the language of economists, they will tell you something like, money is a tool for the transference of purchasing power across time and space. Now, to define purchasing power, I will lean on Murray Rothbard, who's obviously an economist and one of the greatest thinkers in the Austrian school, student of Mises. Rothbard defines purchasing power as the amount of goods and services that a given unit of money can buy. So, purchasing power is a ratio of the favors that can be acquired for a given amount of money. It's basically the inverse of the price, right? Or the reciprocal of the price, if you will. For instance, if gas is $10 per gallon, then the purchasing power of $10 is 1 gallon of gas, right? It's pretty straightforward. Purchasing power, then, it's this mathematical reflection of the goods that have been produced, but they have not yet been consumed. Now, again, in economics terms, that is savings, right? Savings consists of the goods that have been produced but not yet consumed. So as I said earlier, when you go to work and you trade, you produce something for someone and you're paid in money, well, until you spend that money on consumption, you have added to the productive output or the savings of the species. right? You've rendered favors, but you have not received any favors in return. So again, money is the accounting tool or language that makes that relationship very precise, right? That's actually appraising mathematically the value of the favors you have rendered, and thus the value of the favors you are due to receive in exchange. So when we say, you're basically holding on to that money because you believe it's going to hold purchasing power into the future. And when we say that money holds purchasing power, what we mean is that it offers its holder an option to participate in the savings or the consumption of goods produced by physical power, right? It's a mathematical claim, if you will, right? This person who has cash balances in his possession has added to savings and has not yet consumed from the savings. He's due this amount. So that's good, right? That's how money is meant to work. You want people to have this incentive to serve one another and in turn be served by one another, and we can all get on peacefully. We can increase human productivity. We can accumulate more knowledge and get smarter and increase our standards of living and invent all kinds of cool and useful technologies. Like, that's the magic of an economy facilitated by non-political money, right? A money that's really, if money is the language of power, money that's really speaking about physical power rather than political power. The problem arises, however, when this language of power that is money becomes politicized. Again, I'll lean on Rothbard here, who defines politicization as the process by which aspects of our lives, including economic and social interactions, are brought under the control or influence of the state, often through regulation, mandates, or coercive intervention. In Rothbard's view, politicization represents a shift from decentralized, consensual, and private decision-making to centralized, state-directed control where individual freedom and autonomy are curtailed by political power, which again, political power is everywhere and always backed by the threat of physical power, right? Like, it's almost like the abuse of physical power, right? We want to use physical power to serve one another, but when we start using physical power to threaten or harm one another, that's when this game of mutual reciprocal altruism and mutual service degenerates into something much less productive, much less peaceful. If we go back to something we said earlier, which is that money is a tool for the transference of purchasing power across time and space, we get a good frame to look at historical money. So historically, gold has been an excellent means for transferring purchasing power across time because its supply is difficult to expand. However, gold is not so great at moving purchasing power across space because it is physical and heavy. So it's sort of fulfilling the time function, but not so much the space function. So humans, being innovative, we figured out that if we put all the gold in one warehouse, or a safe, or a bank, whatever you want to call this. I'm going to use the term warehouse today because that makes it pretty clear. If we put all the gold into one or a few warehouses, and then those warehouses issue receipts for the depositors of that gold that they can use to go and redeem that gold in the future, then those receipts can be traded as if they were as good as gold. And paper receipts are obviously much more portable than physical gold. So gold-backed currencies of this kind are very useful, right? They'll transfer purchasing power across time. They're also better at transferring purchasing power across space because they're lighter than physical gold. However, those gold-backed currencies depend on the promises of money warehouse operators. those operators have to make the promise that they're not going to engage in the fraud of issuing more warehouse receipts than they have in gold reserves. Or said another way, they're not going to issue more warehouse receipts that represented more gold than they actually had in their warehouses. Right? They're going to be true to the accounting function that they are fulfilling, right? Which is to say, every deposit a gold warehouse operator receives of gold is a liability on his balance sheet. He owes someone that gold. I'm sorry, rather the physical gold is an asset on his balance sheet. The note that he issues to his depositor that can be used to redeem that gold is a liability. So the warehouse operator is liable to that customer for that gold he holds on deposit. If they issue more paper notes than they have gold in reserves, then they have more liabilities than they do assets, and they are insolvent, right? This is fractional reserve banking. This is the problem, basically, with gold. That is, so far as we can tell, unsolvable. And I'll get into really how central banking sort of just emerges from this technical failure of gold, or this need to trust the promises of a warehouse operator, why that leads to central banking in a bit. So to understand just how poorly money warehouse operators have been at keeping this promise, not to engage in fractional reserve banking, not to run an insolvent operation, not to defraud their customers through the overissuance of warehouse receipts, we really need to go back to the beginnings of central banking. And the birth of the modern central bank really begins with the Bank of Amsterdam. So following the creation of the Antwerp Bourse in 1531, which was really a free market, money market, I think one of the first ones of its kind in the West, at least, that was dealing in paper promises for gold. In the wake of this, the Bank of Amsterdam was established roughly 70 years later in 1609 to monopolize and control this market space. So the Bank of Amsterdam's first order of business was to outlaw cashier notes and mandate that all gold and silver coins throughout the city be deposited in their bank. Again, if you're going to monopolize and control the language of power, the first thing you have to do is get it all into your possession. So that's literally the first thing the Bank of Amsterdam did. Basically, by force of law, cashiers were forced to surrender their precious metals in exchange for Bank of Amsterdam warehouse receipts. And this is an important lesson, again, I think for future generations and really anyone that's looking at the nature of money. The Bank of Amsterdam was able to monopolize this layer 2, which we'll call currencies or warehouse receipts, only because it was able to restrict access to layer 1, which were the precious metals themselves, mostly gold. And that's the control, right? The possession is the control, right? Just like with any other asset in the world, physical possession is the ability to control it. Money is the same. We've just really gotten away from our understanding that gold ultimately has to be this commodity, this precious metal, or this energy-backed substance to remain honest across time. We've really lost our grasp of that, and since the founding of this central bank and the subsequent central banks that we'll touch on here. When the Bank of Amsterdam did this, it controls all money matters in its jurisdiction. It warehouses most of the gold, not all of the gold, but most of the gold. It's basically making itself a single node transaction database. This gives them a really unique advantage. The Bank of Amsterdam could basically affect instant transfers between their customers. Since all they have to do, they don't need to move gold around, right? If basically all these people are customers of the central bank just needs to make a ledger entry, right? So you can just, the stroke of the bookkeeper's pen can be used to move money. Now that's a huge advantage from an information system standpoint, but again, it comes at the price of needing to trust the central bank fully, right? That they'll always maintain the peg, that they won't deauthorize the currency, they won't inflate the currency, etc. And so it was really this set of moves that made the Bank of Amsterdam the first central bank, since by force of law, it was required to be central to all money dealings, and no money dealings were legal outside of its centralized purview. And this also sets up the Bank of Amsterdam for its later move, in which it mandated that all the gold be deposited in its warehouse, and then it was eventually able to eliminate the ability for depositors to withdraw physical gold entirely. So again, if we're looking at the central bank as a warehouse operator, which basically that's what it is, it's a very large centralized warehouse of money, takes in gold from depositors, customers, that's an asset on its balance sheet. It issues paper, which is the customer's ability to redeem that gold in the future. That's a liability. When you eliminate convertibility or redeemability of those paper notes into gold, you are effectively defaulting, right? You are scamming all of your customers, basically. And so this is really the nature of the central bank, and this is kind of this ability to suspend convertibility has been instrumental to every central bank in times of crisis ever since. And it really started with this precedent in the Bank of Amsterdam. You know, the significance of that is kind of difficult to understate, rather. When you convince people to trust paper currencies rather than only the underlying precious metal that the paper is intended to represent, the Bank of Amsterdam basically, set the example that all successive central banks would follow, that they're just going to run these insolvent business practices, and in times of crisis, you'll just stick it to the customers by refusing to let them redeem their paper for gold. And indeed, it was the Bank of Amsterdam that directly influenced the creation of its larger and more tyrannical successor, the Bank of England. Fast forward roughly 1688, this is after the Glorious Revolution, in which the Catholic monarch James II was replaced with his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. Glorious Revolution basically resulted in a very significant shift of political power away from the monarchy and toward the parliament. And this mirrored similar changes that had occurred in the Netherlands and elsewhere leading up to that. And at the time, England, at the time of the Glorious Revolution, England had a very decentralized money market in which goldsmiths, a number of goldsmiths issued warehouse receipts, circulated notes, discounted bills, and they all competed with one another, right? So, the reason the competition matters a lot is because if any one of these warehouse operators chooses to engage in the fraud of fractional reserve banking, that fraud tends to get exposed more quickly because, well, customers have other options, right? But if it's a central bank and that fraud is perpetrated, well, customers have no other options, so the fraud can go on for a much longer period of time and even lead to a zero reserve model, which we call fiat currency, that's been used all over the world for the past 50 years. It was ultimately, as is true with most of the history of central banking, that it was the need to finance a war that ultimately drove the English crown to replace this decentralized money market system with its own central bank, in many ways copying the Bank of Amsterdam model. The story of the Bank of England is also what led to the later international gold standard. So it was the pound sterling that had been used as the currency denomination of England since 1158, when King Henry introduced a silver coin of 92.5% purity. Indeed, this is where, and this is true for a lot of currency denominations, is that they actually are a unit of weight, right? Obviously the pound, something we still use in the United States, this represented a specific weight in silver, and it did so until later when England started minting a gold coin in 1663 called the guinea, which was named after the part of Africa in which that gold was being mined. So shortly after the creation of the Bank of England, mathematician and physicist Sir Isaac Newton, acting as the master of mint, permanently altered the arc of monetary history by changing the exchange ratio between gold and silver. Now, typically, this exchange ratio would be freely set on the market, but again, because of the centralization of power surrounding the bank, it was basically price setting this ratio. So Newton changed this exchange rate such that it became profitable for arbitrageurs to export silver and to import gold into England. So obviously, by tilting the incentives in this way, it wasn't long before a great deal of gold began to flow into the Bank of England. And because of gold's superior scarcity in comparison to all other precious metals, England moved to an official gold standard a little over a century later. Now, it's unknown whether Newton did this on purpose. It's been said that he really studied, obviously he was an alchemist. He studied gold very intensely most of his life. The guy's a polymath. We have Newton's, what he had prior to Einstein. It was Newton's laws of physics that we followed, right? Like, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. We had this Newtonian understanding of the universe. So this guy was very bright, to say the least. It is possible that he had a grasp of the superior scarcity of gold and therefore chose to standardize England to it as a money to give England a significant economic and geopolitical advantage far into the future, which you could argue something that has persisted for centuries, even unto this day. And, a way to think about this is that money is basically, again, it's a game, right? This game through which we're counting for and trading favors. But the game, in terms of like the evolutionary perspective on money, the game is to try and hold the form of money that is most difficult to obtain or to produce. And because England standardized to gold, which was the most difficult thing to produce, in doing so, it eventually led to all of these other countries following England after they see England benefit from this advantage that gold gives them over time, which led to the emergence of an international gold standard around the turn of the 20th century. So England, due to the premeditation of Isaac Newton, maybe not, maybe it was accidental, who knows, but it basically became the first mover in this international gold standard game. And that gave England a significant advantage as a global superpower for really many centuries that persisted all the way up until the United States rise to power in the mid-20th century. But I want to focus in on that, what I was saying, that the objective of the game of money is to try and hold the one which is hardest to obtain or produce. I want to explain why that is. Again, if we go back to purchasing power, right, which is the reciprocal of the price, right? So it's how many goods, again, so if the price of gas is $10 per gallon, you would say the purchasing power of $10 is 1 gallon of gas. Now, the purchasing power of that $10 could also be a pound of beef, whatever else is being priced on the market. But when you understand purchasing power in that way as a ratio, right? So if purchasing power is the ratio of goods per unit of money, then the money that is hardest to produce offers its users a purchasing power ratio in which the denominator expands the most slowly. So in a ratio, right, or a fraction, you have top number, numerator, bottom number, denominator. Purchasing power is numerator goods, denominator money. What expands that denominator most slowly will be the thing that maximizes, that will keep the purchasing power ratio maximized no matter what economic conditions prevail, right? If number of goods go up or down, you'll know by holding the hardest they call this hard money, the hardest to produce money, that your purchasing power will be maximized over time because you're holding the money with the least flexible denominator. So if the denominator expands really fast, and obviously you get diluted, but if it doesn't change much or changes very slowly, especially when it changes the most slowly, that means you are in the superior position in terms of purchasing power, storing purchasing power over time in the game of money. I hope that makes sense. It's pretty basic, kind of easy to articulate, kind of difficult to articulate, but easy to see if you write down the ratios or the fractions themselves. England standardizes to gold. The rest of the world eventually follows. England is the superpower of the world. You know, they are the country that controls the waves, controls the world, as has been said. But eventually, you know, a number of intrepid young men seeking to escape the tyranny of the Bank of England would flee to the New World to found the United States of America. Obviously, the American Revolutionary War was fought to establish freedom from the inflation and taxation of England and its central bank. And the founding fathers, because of that experience, they knew, right? They had a deep understanding of the dangers of central banking and, you know, the constitutional documents of the United States, which we were founded as a constitutional republic, were really, you know, to a large extent focused on resisting the implementation of a central bank. And we can get into this more next time, but suffice it to say, after 137 years and 2 temporary central banks, the United States would ultimately fall victim to the third attempt at implementing a central bank, which is the Federal Reserve that was founded in 1913. But that's all a story for another day. The purpose of today was to give you this framing of money as the language of power, and to describe to you how the purchasing power of money works, why the money that has the least flexible supply tends to be favored in free market competition as the money that holds its purchasing power best across time, which is, you know, as we walked through the history of the Bank of Amsterdam and the Bank of England, this is why the world ultimately standardized to gold as money, because it had the least flexible supply of all the precious metals. And to really give you a sense of, you know, how money is the language of power, how it's operated. This language has operated for the past 400 plus years through the different epochs of central banking, and why money as a tool, you know, it's useful obviously for transferring purchasing power across time, but because of that, it always attracts the most potent forms of political power. Right? This is, you know, state corruption, central banking, etc. Like it is, you know, if Lord Acton said absolute power corrupts absolutely, well, this is the closest thing to absolute power, right? It's the language of power, but it's a mathematical language, so it's universal, and it's power in the sense that it lays claim to the products of physical power that people have worked to create over time. So anyone who has the ability to apply force to other people will always try and control or corrupt this language of power. So, of course, you know, the way out of this mess, well, it's to standardize to a monetary system that resists the corruption of political power by being based on facts rather than promises. All right, the fact that we needed to put all this gold in one place and then depend upon the promises of warehouse operators, which would eventually become central banks and statists and bureaucrats, puts us in a disadvantaged position. You're now basing the integrity of the global economy ultimately on the integrity of individuals inside of these institutions. If we could instead base the integrity of the global economic order on something substantial and solid and unshakable, like mathematics, thermodynamics, etc., then we wouldn't have this tyranny and instability that we've experienced in the sphere of money over the past 400 plus years. And now this goes back further than 400 years. Like, there was the debasing of coinage that led to the collapse of ancient Rome, for instance. But I wanted to just focus on this more recent relationship between monetary metal and paper. And paper money actually goes further back too. They practiced this in ancient China. All these things ultimately end in disaster because at the end of the day, it's a fraud. As you've probably guessed, especially if you've ever watched the show, the money that I am advocating for that is based on facts rather than promises is Bitcoin. Right? Bitcoin is a system that's really based 100% on verification and 0% on interpersonal trust. You only really need, as with physical gold, actually, you only really need to trust that individuals will operate in their own self-interest when it comes to Bitcoin, and that's a pretty good bet. But Bitcoin overcomes the challenges of gold because basically all the challenges of gold are rooted in its physicality. The fact that it doesn't move well over space forces us to centralize it, to scale it as a transactional medium. That centralization leads to the centralization of power, basically, and the emergence of very corrupt institutions that grow up around that near absolute power to try and control it. And when they, ultimately we get into like the zero reserve banking standard, so post-fractional reserve, you get into zero reserve banking, which is fiat currency. This gives the state and the central bank the power to issue currency ad infinitum with no check. That's obviously a very bad situation for anyone holding purchasing power in that currency. Again, if you're looking at it from a numerator and denominator standpoint, your denominator in fiat currency can basically go to infinity. And anything divided by infinity, no matter how much purchasing power you have, if it's divided by infinity, it's zero. So we're gonna leave it here for now. But let's just, to conclude, let me frame Bitcoin as the projection of physical power that protects your purchasing power from plundering by political power. And we talked about purchasing power today, so you've hopefully got that. Hopefully understood the political power aspect. The physical power aspect of Bitcoin really is just the energy expenditure of proof of work mining. The fact that real energy has to be expended to create or earn Bitcoin is the key ingredient. This is the same key ingredient that's made gold such an excellent means of storing purchasing power across time for centuries. It's also coded directly into Bitcoin. However, Bitcoin is better than gold at resisting plundering by political power because Bitcoin is non-physical, right? It's just pure information. We don't need to centralize the custody of Bitcoin to scale it as a transactional medium. To take possession of Bitcoin is trivial. It's just information. You can store it in any information-bearing medium, whether that's your head, a sheet of paper, a computer. And it gives you just a ton of flexibility in terms of securing this asset from plundering in general, but specifically plundering from political power. So that's it for today. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you find this framing of money as the language of power useful. And maybe next time we'll jump into more of a history of recent central banking like the Federal Reserve and talk about how it has impacted and influenced the distribution of power in the world. Okay, thank you.